Continue our reflection on the life and times of the late Archbishop Emeritus Desmond Tutu. While he was Anglican, he also had many close ties with the Catholic faith. Gootah Soomer-macher is editor of the Southern Cross, that's a Catholic magazine. He joins us now to share some of those memories of the Arch. Good afternoon, Mr. Soomer-macher. You know, as a religious magazine editor, you, I would say, have most certainly written the most in-depth articles on the Arch. It was interesting, though, for me to note while reading through the Arch's history that his first exposure to Christianity was in fact through the Methodist Church. He was baptized there, which probably explains the oscillation between Catholic and Anglican practices. Just talk to me about his childhood and that move to the Anglican Church that then ultimately introduced us to this great bishop.
Yes, good afternoon. Yes, he was baptized and raised in the Methodist Church that his parents belonged to in Klerksdorp and other parts of what is now the Northwest Province. But as a young lad, he was about 14 years old when he went to Sophia town in Johannesburg to be educated there. And there he came under the influence of Father Trevor Huddleston, who later on, of course, will become an archbishop. One of the early giants of Christian leadership in the struggle against apartheid. And I think that is how the young Desmond arrived at becoming an Anglican. He also was very interested in the Catholic Church. And well, between high Anglicanism and the Catholic practice of the faith, there isn't a huge amount of difference. So it was a similar sort of direction to take. Mm-hmm. He did marry a Catholic woman, of course, and that was in a Catholic church. And once he married Leah, well, he could not become a Catholic priest anymore. So if ever he had any ideas that he might want to become a Catholic priest, that was pretty much the end of that because, well, as we know, Catholic priests are not allowed to be married.
Mm-hmm. And then to his career, though, as a teacher in South Africa, rather, as well as in Lesotho, and then his transition to priest. His life was characterized, I've been saying this to many, that it was characterized by many firsts. First, black college staff member of the Federal Theology Seminary, and I understand that that's around the period when he started to support the black consciousness movement in Fort Hare when he was chaplain. Just talk to me about this period of his life.
Well, that is one period that I must be very honest with you, I am not an expert on, and other people are more qualified to speak about that than I am. But what I do know is that he was actually a very reluctant political figure, political leader. He was not really interested in becoming a political figure, to be involved in political discourse and struggle. He wanted to serve God. That was his primary motivation in joining the Anglican priesthood. But he was forced into becoming a political activist by the circumstances, by seeing the suffering of people, and also, of course, by following the example of other Christian leaders who had paved the path before him, people like Father Huddleston and the Catholic Archbishop of Durban, Archbishop Dennis Hurley.
Mm-hmm. Then talk to me about the discomfort, though, within the religious community when they started to hear this political rhetoric, particularly anti-government rhetoric, because we know in the church there were those who were liberals, who perhaps sympathized, but at times felt he was a bit of a radical. How was it in the religious community in terms of some of his statements and his activism outside of the church?
Well, there is a famous graffito that appeared in Cape Town near the turn of Two Bishops' Court when the Arch became the Archbishop of Cape Town, the Anglican Archbishop of Cape Town. And the graffiti said, "I was an Anglican until I put two and two together." So clearly he was a divisive figure for many people in the pews, and as well, of course, for leadership, for Christian leadership, as it was for, I think, all Christian leaders who were involved in politics. I mean, there was like that in the Catholic Church as well, that even among archbishops, and there were very few archbishops at the same time in South Africa, there would be huge differences of opinion. You would have 4 archbishops and you would have 4 opinions about how to approach the question of apartheid. And in the Anglican Church, it was very similar. I think it was the leadership of Archbishop Tutu that brought quite a few of religious leaders into the struggle.
I must say he was somewhat of a maverick. I know many have not described him as such, but I really marveled at his independence in thought, because here you had a man who independently interpreted the word. You know, when we speak of his interpretation of the gospel, that he said that his was the mandate of the gospel. But here, beyond that conversation of apartheid, you also had a man who advocated for the LGBTI community, again, adding controversy to the church. I mean, how difficult was that conversation? Because this was a man who was steadfast in his beliefs and said he cannot go to a heaven where it's in fact homophobic. He would rather go straight to hell.
Well, he was most certainly a very outspoken archbishop, and while one might not agree with everything that he said, I think one can discern in him a prophetic figure, almost like the prophets in the Bible. He often would do things unilaterally. That was one of the criticisms that was often leveled against him. He would do things without consulting. And Archbishop Gootah, who is the Catholic Archbishop of Johannesburg, he's once said something very interesting in relation to Archbishop Tutu. He said, well, yes, here's a prophetic figure. And where in the Bible do you find the prophets going around consulting all over the place before they were making the prophetic statements? And I think that's exactly how we have to see Archbishop Tutu. He was a prophet. He spoke truth to power, but at the same time, he spoke love to power as well. That is something that takes the courage of a biblical prophet.
And I mean, you must, if you are to be remembered, possibly break away from the norm, which is what he honestly tried to do in most instances. But in terms of transformation in the church itself, beyond his interpretation, because it is conservative, but in terms of racial issues within the church, when we first then saw him become the first bishop in Johannesburg, how difficult a period was that for those within the church, especially being conservative? And we cannot shy away from the fact that many of the white churchgoers at the time could have been many things at the same time. You had sometimes apartheid leaders who in fact were Christians themselves. And it probably became difficult in that respect, that they're staunch Christians, but also here presiding over a government that is unjust. How difficult was it in the church to deal with the race issue itself in terms of transformation and having black leaders actually ascending to those leadership positions?
I'm sure it was very difficult for those people who were used to white privilege to accept at the time. That graffito I was referring to in Cape Town, that I put 2 and 2 together, graffito, is a very good example of that it was very difficult for some people to accept. If not a black archbishop, then certainly a black archbishop who was so outspoken and who would speak truth to political power and who would rattle cages. And as we have seen, he was rattling cages, not just against apartheid, he was later rattling cages against the ANC government as well. So here we have somebody who was outspoken on all kinds of issues. And he was somebody who would cause discomfort. And that is what the church needs. We need people who are going to challenge us in our preconceptions. Whether the people like it or not, that is something that is so needed in the church. And I'm talking about the Christian church in general, not just the Catholic or the Anglican church. I think that all the churches need to have figures like Archbishop Tutu and Archbishop Hurley and people like that to discern God in action in the life of a nation.
And we're certainly not looking to always consult, like you say, be the prophets, you know, just break away from this tradition of conservative culture, etc. And then for you, though, intimate moments or fondest moments that you shared with the Arch?
Well, he was my next door neighbor, so I occasionally would see him walking past, and once in a while we would exchange words. What struck me about him is that the private Desmond Tutu was not the same person at all times, anyway, as the public Desmond Tutu. Now, I'm not saying that he was putting on a show when he was in public, because sometimes that ebullient character would come out as well in private conversation. But he was a far more introspective sort of person when he was in private. He was certainly a very nice neighbor.
No, you clearly had the most privileged position, just being a neighbor of the Arch. Anytime you had problems, you needed the laying of hands, you quickly went to the Arch and just had your prayers there and then.
I did not. No, I did not want to disturb him and make capital out of having a well-known neighbor. I mean, at the same time, he didn't really come over to me to ask me for my professional journalistic advice. So we would relate to one another as neighbors, and that, I think, is the best way it should be. And it was quite interesting that in Milnerton, that was pretty much how most of the residents treated having Archbishop Tutu as somebody living in the suburb. They would greet him, and he would greet very nicely back. And at Mug and Bean, he would have a cup of coffee, and people would wave, and he would wave back. But very few people were starstruck by Archbishop, which probably speaks to his character as well. That he was so down to earth that one didn't have to be starstruck. One wasn't under the impression that he was some sort of super celebrity that we should be almost scared to approach.
Sure. No, so beautiful. Did you ever interact with Mama Leah, though? Or perhaps ever be that peeping Tom to see them sitting in the garden having tea or having conversations?
I was not a peeping Tom looking over the wall, no, but certainly on Sunday we made a point of going over to Mama Leah and express our condolences. And she is an absolutely wonderful woman. I love her to bits. And she was grieving. She was very, very tired indeed. And yet she was reminiscing about how I would be pushing my son in the pram when they first moved into the house next door to us 25 years ago. That was what she wanted to talk about, and talk about the magazine that I edited and all these things. She's a lovely person.
Sure. No, certainly we're very privileged to have lived in their time. Thank you very much. That is Gootah Soomer-macher just sharing his insights. Well, when we return, we continue our rolling coverage celebrating the life of the Arch. Do stay with us.